So the first set of protests took place in 2019 over what is now known as the extradition law. So the point of the extradition law was essentially to bring Hong Kong under the same legal jurisdiction as China when it came to those who had committed crimes in China or against China. There's a lot more to it than that. There's lots and lots of detail to it. But essentially what people were worried about was that it was violating the one country, two systems and the basic law of Hong Kong, which basically grants Hong Kong semi-independent status until full reunification in 2047. The protest started as peaceful marches of over 2 million people and slowly escalated into violent clashes between the police and protesters, the taking over of university campuses by students, and eventually the storming of the LegCo by a breakaway group, which some people argue also included mainland plants who were trying to sabotage the protest, but it doesn't really matter now because it's all over. Eventually, the extradition bill was withdrawn from Parliament in October of 2019, but that did not stop the troubles for the protesters. Other things that they asked for example, Carrie Lam stepping down from office, they did not get. And in general, the security situation in Hong Kong had been really heightened. The police, who used to have a really good reputation in Hong Kong, their reputation was in tatters and they didn't seem to care. They were taking extra measures, especially with young people, especially if young men were wearing black, sort of stopping and searching people at random, breaking up any large groups. There was just like a general atmosphere of heightened suspense at basically all times. There was a lot of back and forth during this period. People weren't really sure if the protests were going to continue or not. Essentially, the problem had been solved, and then COVID broke out at the beginning of 2020. So the mass protesting side of things came to a halt pretty quickly. However, things came to a head once again when in 2020, the government announced that they were going to enact a new bill, which was the National Security Bill. So this was sort of framed as a response to the violence of the previous year. If you don't know anything about the law, it essentially criminalizes secession, subversion of the central government, terrorism, and interference from outside parties or governments in China's internal affairs. So protests erupted immediately, regardless of COVID. And a fight actually broke out in the LegCo, where the pro-Beijing clique was trying to take the floor from the pro-democracy clique, and people were dragged out by security. It was very dramatic. I think at one point someone threw a potted plant at someone. I may be mixing up my acts of defiance here, but needless to say, things got very heated and the tensions were running very high. It's at this point that things started spiraling completely out of control. So Carrie Lam suspended the parliamentary elections, ostensibly because of the pandemic, but really I think because the pro-Beijing party were not sure that they would be able to win a majority, which they absolutely had to do if they were going to get the National Security Bill passed. Prominent activists known as the Hong Kong 12 tried to flee for Taiwan by speedboat and were detained without being able to see anyone. The pro-China counter-protesters started beating up people in MTR stations, textbooks, statues, shops, merch, anything that alluded to the protests or any sort of anti-China sentiment, anything bad that had happened in Chinese history were all banned and all shut down. People started applying for their BNOs, which is the right to live in the UK, before the deadline, and around 90,000 people in total left the country. Carrie Lam stepped down for somebody even less likable, if that was even possible, and all of this is happening as COVID is going on. So needless to say that it was a crazy 2 years for the protesters, and it did not end well for them. The failure of the protests and the eventual introduction of the National Security Law is what paved the way for Article 23 to be introduced. What the National Security Law did was allow the mainland Chinese government, through the mechanism of Hong Kong police, Hong Kong legislature and things like that, to slowly do away with any dissident voices and any potential resistance or opposition to pro-Beijing sentiment in Hong Kong. Any sort of effective opposition was forcibly or gradually removed rights activists, NGOs, all of these people were sort of silenced, or their voices were marginalized, minimized, and pushed to the side. We have some really big examples. For example, there's the arresting and fleeing of high-profile dissidents such as Nathan Law from Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government offering bounties up to $1 million Hong Kong dollars for information about their whereabouts. So that shows you just how important it is for the Chinese government to silence these people and their voices. Newsrooms across Hong Kong, sort of independent media, were raided. Several newspapers, such as the Stand News, were forced to shut down completely, and freedom of press in Hong Kong basically fell off a cliff. Teenagers as young as 14, 15, 16 were arrested for subversion and inciting secession, which is like... And I think the biggest piece of news to come out of it is the trial of a man called Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is like a media tycoon in Hong Kong. He owned the newspaper The Apple Daily, and that was sort of like the last bastion of free speech in the Chinese language, in Cantonese, in Hong Kong. His trial is equivalent to like the trial of the century in Hong Kong. Like if he goes down, it is like completely over. He's being charged with conspiracy to collude with foreign forces and conspiring to publish seditious publications. The government has also been able to silence what may have been legitimate political opposition to these articles being introduced as well. So generally speaking, in the Hong Kong legislature, you have like the pro-democracy, as they're sort of known, camp, and the pro-Beijing camp. It's an oversimplification, but it works for what we're kind of talking about right now. What the legislature did after the national security law was introduce a new bill, or a new sort of requirement, that anybody who stands for lawmaker, so stands for like the highest office in the LegCo, has to pass a patriotism test before taking office. So basically they have to pledge their allegiance to mainland China, which not everybody was comfortable with doing. I'm sure you can guess who those people were. Just in case the pro-democracy camp wasn't deflated enough, however, the government went a step further in 2021 by arresting 47 pro-democracy campaigners for holding what they termed to be illegal primaries and charging them with conspiracy to commit subversion under the national security law. So what they did was they basically set up mini primaries in different districts so that they could make sure that the most popular candidate for that district in the pro-democracy camp was the one that they would put forward, right? So like a regular primary like you have in like the US as well. But these were deemed illegal. They were told that you're only doing this so that you can get the majority and therefore veto bills, which is like, yes, that's the whole point of parliament. But, you know, this was all heightened, sort of ridiculous lengths. Like, you know, you're trying to make the executive of Hong Kong step down. You're trying to shut down the government. And so a lot of these people were detained. I think the majority of them are now held without bail for trial. They've been held for like over 2 years. Some of them have agreed to testify against the other ones, which I guess is just how it goes. Not everybody can go to prison for life. Some people have families. But yeah, it just shows how the introduction of the national security law was a key moment in sort of eroding any possibility of really standing up to whatever the Chinese government would want to impose upon Hong Kong from that point forwards.